June 8, 793 AD, a date etched in the memory of the Western world. Not because of a great victory or the coronation of a king, but because of a silence that was broken forever. Close your eyes and transport yourself to the holy island of Lindisfarne, off the northeast coast of England. It is a place where the boundary between the earth and the heavens feels incredibly thin. At low tide, a land bridge connects the monastery to the mainland. But at high tide, the ocean swallows the path, cutting the island off from the rest of the world. For the monks and nuns who lived there, this isolation was not a burden. It was a gift. It was a sanctuary of peace, learning, and absolute devotion. The morning began as every morning had for over 100 years. The sun rose over a gray, calm sea. The air was cold and tasted of salt. Inside the stone walls of the priory, the only sounds were the scratching of quills on parchment and the soft, rhythmic chanting of morning prayers. In the scriptorium, scribes were creating masterpieces, illuminating the Gospels with gold and vibrant colors, believing they were doing God's work in a garden of safety. They believed they were protected, not by walls, for Lindisfarne had no fortifications, not by soldiers, for they had no weapons. They were protected by the sanctity of their faith. They believed that no human hand would dare touch the house of God. But on this particular June morning, the horizon held a secret. If you had been standing on the rocky shore, looking out into the mist, you might have seen them. At first, just dark specks against the pale sky, shadows dancing on the water. Perhaps the monks thought they were traders, merchants coming from the continent to exchange wine for wool. But as the shapes grew larger, the atmosphere shifted. The birds stopped singing. The wind seemed to hold its breath. These were not merchant vessels. They were long, sleek, and predatory, crafted from oak, shallow-bottomed, to cut through the waves with terrifying speed. And at the prow of each ship, rising from the wood like a nightmare made manifest, was the carved head of a dragon. The residents of Lindisfarne did not know it yet, but the world they knew was about to end. The age of innocence was over. The age of the wolf was beginning. The confusion on the beach likely lasted only a few moments. As the keels of the ships ground against the pebbles and sand, the reality of the situation became horrifyingly clear. The men poring over the sides of the vessels were not there to trade. They were giants, clad in leather and furs, their eyes scanning the monastery not with reverence, but with calculation. These were the Norsemen, the Vikings. To the peaceful community of St. Cuthbert, they must have looked like demons rising from the abyss. They spoke a language that sounded like grinding stones. They moved with a synchronized, lethal efficiency that suggested this was not their first hunt. What followed was not a battle. A battle implies two sides fighting. This was a harvest. The alarm was raised, but it was a hollow sound against the roar of the invaders. Monks and nuns, trained only in the turning of pages and the tending of gardens, found themselves facing men who had been born with axes in their hands. The psychological shock was paralyzed. Why were they here? What did they want? The answer was simple and devastating. They wanted everything. The raiders moved through the monastery like a flood. They kicked open the doors to the sanctuaries, their heavy boots desecrating the holy ground. The glimmer of gold and silver from the altars caught their eyes. Chalices, meant for the blood of Christ, were snatched by rough hands. Reliquaries, housing the bones of saints, were smashed open, the contents discarded on the floor as worthless trash, while the jeweled casings were stuffed into sacks. But the most valuable treasure at Lindisfarne was not the gold, it was the people. In the chaos, the violence was sharp and absolute. Those who tried to block the path, the elderly monks who stood their ground, clutching wooden crosses, were removed from existence with a single swing. We will not describe the gore, but imagine the sound. The sickening thud of iron meeting silence. The sudden extinguishing of a life, like a candle pinched out by two fingers. The younger monks, and especially the nuns, faced a different terror. They were not met with the finality of the blade. Instead, they were met with the chain. Imagine the panic of a young woman who has spent her entire life within the hushed walls of a convent. She has taken vows of silence, of poverty, and of chastity. Her body is a temple, untouched and hidden. Suddenly, that temple is invaded. Rough hands grab her habit, dragging her from the altar where she sought refuge. She is not seen as a person. In the eyes of these invaders, she is a commodity. She is currency. The screaming that echoed across the island that day was not just of pain, but of disbelief. The library, home to centuries of knowledge, was ransacked. Pages of scripture, written with infinite patience, were trampled into the mud, mixing with the crimson stains that now covered the holy earth. As the sun began to set on June 8th, the smoke from the burning buildings rose into the sky, a black signal fire visible for miles. The ships pushed off from the shore, heavier now. They were laden with gold, silver, and a huddled, terrified mass of humanity. The survivors looked back at their burning home, watching the only world they had ever known disappear into the distance. They were leaving the realm of God and entering a world of shadows. For the nuns trapped on those wooden decks, surrounded by the smell of smoke and the coarse laughter of their captors, the raid was over. But the true horror, the long, slow descent into the nightmare of the North, had only just begun. The days that followed the raid were a blur of gray water and gray sky. The journey from the coast of England back to Scandinavia, or the Viking settlements in Ireland, was not a cruise. It was a test of endurance that broke the weak and scarred the strong. For the captured nuns and monks, the longship was a prison without bars. There was no below deck, no shelter from the biting wind or the freezing spray of the North Sea. They sat huddled together in the center of the ship, surrounded by the loot taken from their own sanctuary. A golden cross might be lying next to a terrified woman's foot. A holy chalice rolled across the deck with the rhythm of the waves, clinking against the wood. It was a cruel irony. The sacred objects they had spent their lives polishing and protecting were now just cargo, indistinguishable from the human cargo sitting beside them. The conditions were brutal. The North Sea is unforgiving. Even in summer, waves would crash over the low sides of the vessel, soaking their woolen habits, chilling them to the bone. There was no privacy. The modesty that had defined their lives in the monastery was stripped away by necessity and indifference. They slept sitting up or curled in tight balls, trying to steal warmth from one another. But the physical suffering was nothing compared to the psychological terror. Imagine the soundscape of that journey, the rhythmic creaking of the oars, the snapping of the sail, and the voices of the captors. To the nuns, the Norse language sounded harsh, guttural, utterly alien. They could not understand the commands barking out above the wind. They could only guess, flinching every time a shadow fell over them. They watched the warriors who had slaughtered their brothers and sisters. They saw them laugh, eat, and sleep as if nothing had happened. This was perhaps the hardest truth to swallow. To the victims, this was the apocalypse. To the Vikings, it was just a Tuesday. It was just a job. Fear was a constant companion. Every time a warrior looked their way, the women must have held their breath, praying to become invisible. They were defenseless, surrounded by armed men who operated under a moral code completely different from their own. In the Christian world, mercy was a virtue. In the Viking world, strength was the only law. As the days turned into a week, a transformation began to take place. The identities they had clung to began to dissolve. They were no longer Sister Mary or Brother Thomas. They were no longer scribes or gardeners. They were becoming something less. They were being conditioned to obey, conditioned to silence. The sea washed away their past, mile by freezing mile. Land finally appeared on the horizon. But it was not a sight of relief. It was the beginning of the next phase of their dehumanization. The ships docked at one of the great trading hubs of the Viking Age. Perhaps it was Hedeby in Denmark, or the bustling slave markets of Dublin. As the captives were herded off the ships, their legs stiff from days of confinement, they were met with an assault on the senses. The market was a chaotic, noisy, stinking beast. The air was thick with the smell of wood smoke, tar, unwashed bodies, and roasting meat. Traders from all over the known world gathered here. You could hear a dozen languages being spoken: Arabic, Frankish, Saxon, and Norse, but the universal language here was silver. The captives were marched into the slave pens. These were often just fenced-in areas of mud, exposed to the elements where humans were kept like livestock waiting for auction. And that is exactly what they were. Livestock. This is where the final stripping of dignity occurred. The commodification. Prospective buyers would circulate through the pens. They were not looking for souls. They were looking for utility. A strong man for the fields, a skilled craftsman for the workshop, a young woman for the house. The inspection process was cold and clinical. A buyer might grab a nun's face, forcing her mouth open to check her teeth, ensuring she was healthy enough to survive a winter of hard labor. They would squeeze arms and legs to test for muscle tone. They would look into their eyes, not to make a connection, but to check for signs of sickness or rebellion. For the nuns, this was a violation almost as painful as physical violence. They had spent their lives covering their bodies, hiding their hair, lowering their eyes in humility. Now they were exposed, poked, and prodded by strange men, while crowds haggled over their price. "How much for this one?" a voice might ask, pointing to a woman who had once led the choir in Lindisfarne. 3 ounces of silver, the trader might reply, tossing a weighted scale onto the table. 3 ounces, that was the value of a life. That was the price of a human being who had dreams, fears, and a family. Families and communities were torn apart in these markets. A monk might be sold to a farm in Sweden, while the nun he had grown up with was sold to a chieftain in Iceland. There were no goodbyes, just the exchange of coins, the transfer of a rope leash, and they were dragged away in opposite directions, likely never to see a friendly face again. The terror of the raid was sudden and sharp, but the terror of the market was slow and crushing. It was the realization that there was no rescue coming, the realization that you were now property, the realization that the God you prayed to had let this happen. As they were led away by their new masters, walking into the vast, unknown landscapes of Scandinavia, the silence returned. But it was not the peaceful silence of the monastery. It was the silence of a soul that has been shut down. They were now thralls. And in the eyes of the law, a thrall was not a person. A thrall was a tool that could speak, and their new life, the life of the invisible chain, was about to begin. The monastery was a memory. The sea was a memory. Now there was only the farm. For the majority of captured nuns and monks, life settled into a grueling rhythm of survival in the rural landscapes of Norway, Sweden, or Iceland. The Viking Age was not just built on the gold they stole. It was built on the backs of the people they stole. A thrall's life was defined by two things: the endless gray sky above and the hard frozen earth below. Imagine a woman who once spent her days copying scripture in a silent library. Now her hands, once stained only with ink, were cracked and bleeding from grinding grain, shearing sheep, and hauling water from icy streams. The labor was relentless. From the moment the sun rose until long after it set, she belonged to the farm. But the physical exhaustion was a mercy in disguise. It numbed the mind. The true horror lay in the legal reality of her existence. We know exactly how these people were treated because the Norse wrote it down. In the Gragas, the Grey Goose laws of Iceland, the status of a thrall is laid out with chilling clarity. A thrall was not a who. A thrall was a what. If a master killed his own slave, it was not murder. It was simply a loss of property, like breaking a plow or losing a cow. If a stranger killed a slave, they didn't pay a fine to the victim's family. They paid the master for the replacement cost. For the female captives, the nuns of Lindisfarne, the farmhouse held a specific suffocating dread. In the Viking longhouse, there were no private rooms. There were no locks on the doors. Privacy was a luxury of the free. For a woman considered property, the concept of consent did not exist in the law. We must speak carefully here, but we must also speak the truth. Many of these women were brought into the household not just to work the loom or stir the pot. They were there to serve the master's will in all things. Imagine the psychological weight of that existence. During the day, she serves food to the man who burned her home. She nurses the children of the woman who treats her with disdain. And at night, she lies in the darkness, listening to the breathing of the household, knowing that her body is no longer her own sanctuary. It is a possession. The safe list of history often forgets the children born of this darkness. A child born to a thrall woman and a free man was usually born a slave. The cycle of bondage could last for generations. The nuns' holy vows of chastity were shattered, not by her choice, but by the iron law of conquest. Yet, she had to survive. She had to find a reason to wake up. Resistance was rarely physical. To strike a master was to invite death. often a slow, public, and agonizing one to serve as a warning to others. So resistance went inward. It lived in the small, invisible moments. It was the nun whispering the Lord's Prayer in Latin while she milked the goats, the rhythm of the words matching the rhythm of her hands. It was the crude cross, fashioned from 2 twigs and hidden inside a straw mattress. It was the way she taught her half-Norse children a lullaby from England, planting a tiny seed of her lost culture in the mind of the next generation. They could own her labor, they could own her body, but they could not fully conquer the fortress of her mind. For centuries, these stories were just that, stories. Tales recorded by biased monks or vaguely mentioned in Viking sagas. Historians often debated, was it really that bad? Was the slavery really that widespread? But in the 21st century, the dead began to speak, and they spoke through the code of life itself, DNA. When scientists analyzed the genetic makeup of the modern population of Iceland, they found a startling, uneven divide. The founding fathers of Iceland, the male lines, were overwhelmingly Norse, hailing from Norway and Sweden, but the founding mothers, the female lines, told a completely different story. More than 60% of the original female settlers in Iceland were not Viking women. They were Celtic. They were from the British Isles. They were from Scotland, Ireland, and the coasts of England. The implication of this data is staggering. It suggests that the colonization of Iceland was not a migration of Viking families moving happily to a new land. It was a migration of Viking men bringing with them a massive population of captive women. The DNA confirms the history. These women did not go willingly. They were the cargo of the longships. They were the nuns of Lindisfarne, the villagers of the Hebrides, the daughters of Ireland. Their biology is woven into the very fabric of the Nordic nations today, a silent testament to a mass abduction on an industrial scale. But if the DNA tells us where they came from, archaeology tells us how some of them died, and one account in particular freezes the blood. It comes from Ahmad Ibn Fadlan, an Arab diplomat who traveled north to the Volga River in the year 921 AD. He encountered a group of Vikings, the Rus, and witnessed the funeral of a great chieftain. His writing is not a legend, it is a journalistic report, and it describes a ritual that gives us a glimpse into the darkest fate a slave could face, the angel of death. When the chieftain died, his body was placed on his ship, but he could not go to the afterlife alone. He needed servants. Ibn Fadlan reports that the slaves were asked, "Who will die with him?" In his account, a young slave woman volunteers. But modern historians question how much choice she truly had. Was it religious fervor? Was it the pressure of a life where she had no value otherwise? Or was it a drugged coercion? Ibn Fadlan describes the days leading up to the ceremony. The woman was given intoxicating drinks, kept in a state of trance, perhaps to numb the terror of what was coming. She was treated like a queen for a brief moment, singing and moving through the camp, but it was the celebration of a sacrificial lamb. On the final day, she was led to the ship. Ibn Fadlan describes an old woman, a priestess, whom the Vikings called the angel of death. She was the orchestrator of the end. The atmosphere was heavy with the sound of chanting and the rhythmic beating of shields. Why did the men beat their shields? Ibn Fadlan tells us clearly, to drown out the sound of her screams, so that other slave girls would not be terrified to do the same in the future. We will not describe the moment the light left her eyes, but imagine the scene. The fire rising to consume the ship, the smoke carrying the souls of the master and his property into the gray sky. This was the ultimate reality of being a thrall. You existed for the master, and if the master died, your purpose ended. You were expendable. This is the history that doesn't make it into the adventurous movies or the heroic sagas. The Vikings were explorers. Yes, they were craftsmen, yes, but they were also keepers of a system that viewed human beings as fuel for their fires, both in this life and the next. The nuns of Lindisfarne may not have ended up on a burning ship on the Volga, but they lived in the same world. A world where their lives hung by a thread, held in the hands of men who worshipped gods of war, not a god of mercy. History is often written in blood, but it is rewritten by time. For the nuns and monks captured in the 9th and 10th centuries, there was no Hollywood rescue mission. There was no great uprising where they overthrew their masters and sailed home. Most of them died in the land of their captors, buried in shallow graves, far from the consecrated ground of Lindisfarne. But if we step back and look at the span of centuries, a different kind of victory emerges, a quiet, slow-burning victory. The Vikings had stolen the gold, the chalices, and the people of the Christian world. But in doing so, they inadvertently brought a Trojan horse into their own homes. They brought the very faith they had tried to plunder. Inside the longhouses, it was the enslaved women who raised the children while the men were away on raids. It was the Christian nursemaids who sang lullabies about a God of love, not a God of war. It was the captured priests who, even in chains, impressed their masters with their literacy and their knowledge of the wider world. Slowly, imperceptibly, the ice began to melt. Archaeology shows us this transition. In the graves of the late Viking Age, we start to see a strange mixture. A warrior buried with his sword, but wearing a pendant that is half Thor's hammer, half Christian cross. It was a hedging of bets, a blending of worlds. By the 11th century, the transformation was complete. The great Viking kings, Harald Bluetooth, Olaf Tryggvason, converted to Christianity. The raiding stopped. The dragon ships that once brought terror now brought missionaries and bishops. The society that had burned monasteries began to build cathedrals. The descendants of the very nuns who were dragged screaming onto the ships came the mothers of a new Christian Scandinavia. In the end, the soft power of the captives overcame the hard power of the conquerors. The sword can conquer a village, but it cannot conquer an idea. However, we must not romanticize this. This cultural shift came too late for the thousands who suffered in the darkness of the 9th century. For the woman who stood on the beach at Lindisfarne on that June morning in 793, the future rise of Christian Norway meant nothing. Her reality was the cold, the labor, and the loss of her name. Today, if you visit Lindisfarne, the ruins of the priory still stand against the gray North Sea sky. They are red sandstone skeletons, open to the wind and rain. It is a place of profound beauty, but also of profound melancholy. Tourists walk where the monks once fell. They take photos where the library once burned. The scream of the raid has been replaced by the cry of seagulls and the gentle lapping of the tide. But the true monument to that day is not made of stone. It is made of blood. It is living in the DNA of the people of Iceland, the people of the Faroe Islands, and the people of Scandinavia. It is a biological archive of survival. The story of the Viking raid on Lindisfarne is usually told as a story of warriors, axes, and fury. But that is only half the truth. The other half is the story of the cargo, the story of the women and men who were forced to endure the unendurable. They remind us that history is not just about the winners, it is about the survivors. It is about the human capacity to find light when the world has gone dark. The Vikings may have burned the books and they may have enslaved the bodies, but they could not extinguish the spirit. And in the long, silent game of history, that is the only thing that truly matters. The dragon ships are gone. The axes have rusted into the earth. But the prayers whispered in the dark, they are still echoing.